Thank you for joining our last panel of Building Publics, Humanities Combating Isolation, a series where we feature and workshop the projects developed by the SOF Heyman Center for the Humanities and Humanities New York Public Humanities Graduate Student Fellows. My name is Maria Gonzalez Pendaz, the coordinator of the Public Humanities Initiative at the SOF Heyman. Most of you are tired of hearing me introduce myself and introduce the series, but still I will do just that once more for those new to it, and also as a way to offer some commentary as a mode of a conclusion, given that today is our last meeting. This series is part of a larger commitment here at the SOF Heyman to promote civically engaged and public-facing humanities work and teaching at Columbia University. This initiative in particular offers a group of graduate students financial support and mentoring to develop and implement their public humanities projects throughout the year. For the past 6 weeks and concluding today, our outgoing fellows have presented the fruits of such efforts, which for the most part I've had the great pleasure to see along. An interdisciplinary group of emerging scholars, the fellows have worked both together and independently to devise and implement projects that bridge humanistic thinking with civic engagement and social justice, scholarly research with community building and public communication. Throughout the series, they have discussed the origins of their projects in a commitment to break out of academic silos. They have discussed the assumptions with which they entered the program and how these have changed. And they've made reflections on the current state of their projects and of their thinking about the field of public humanities. The presentations typically revealed the very tensions that inform public humanities work on a day-to-day basis, what we have discussed throughout the year as the tensions between methods and media, or between content and form. So every week we talk about the communities, or the fellows discuss the communities and the social or public issues that they each tackle with their projects and through their disciplinary expertise, but also always in relation to the media by which such relations and related knowledges are produced. These go well beyond the traditional research paper that has long defined humanistic work. While everyone is certainly busy writing their dissertation chapters, and I know Akua today is coming, is bridging literally. I think in the morning she writes the dissertation and in the afternoon she's done the public humanities work. Here, we talk about a variety of other media that not only help build community ties, but also produce new forms of reciprocal knowledge. So in the spirit of the collective nature of the process, and as a way to peek into the many, many conversations that all of you have had with members of the various communities, every workshop also has included discussions with fellow guest scholars and community partners who had been part of the conception of the project. We have heard about podcasting and GIS, for instance, as technologies that can help us tell new stories and reach new audiences. We have seen how art exhibitions curated by elite institutions can be reinvented online and through Google Forms to help Latinx communities build narratives of self-representation. The media that our fellows deploy are not, however, constrained to the digital, but also pertain Luddite approaches, if you will, such as walking and letter writing. Something we have also widely debated through the years, how digital humanities must be part of the public humanities, but these two are not necessarily the same. In fact, addressing what are now the vivid inequalities of the digital divide or the digital bubbles seems crucial to the field of public humanities. Last week, for instance, we heard about approaches to pedagogy, broadly understood, in the prison, a context where the good old worksheet and the crayon has to do, together, of course, with the power of the word and of images, the power of critical thinking and of the imagination. Such are the tools that as humanists, you all know how to deploy and explore amidst the communities with which you work. Before I introduce our speaker for today, Akua Banful, who will go farther into creative and engaged approaches to pedagogy and climate justice, before her, I wanted to offer a few concluding reflections for the year. I offer these to all of outgoing fellows and incoming fellows and to our guests today as well. I offer this as a way to perhaps inform our closing discussion afterwards, perhaps as an invitation to reassess the scope of your projects and of your careers as public humanists in the near future, and certainly as a form of gratitude. I have said this to each of you in particular, but I'll say it collectively now. It really has been an honor to work with you all. I learned a great deal from everyone and have been impressed by your dedication and openness to continually rethink the limits and assumptions of your projects, particularly in the last few months. As the world crumbled around us in the face of COVID-19 crisis, and we retreated into the domestic and virtual realms, and as we later went back out into the streets to protest the racial brutality and the systemic racism that structure our daily lives, including the way we teach and work in academia, as we all went through all of this together but apart, you all kept at it, you kept at work. And I know it has not always been easy. So I want to thank you. It seems to me, however, that we all kept on going in this series and in your public humanities work, not in the vein of productivity or to simply get more things done. We kept at it, I suspect, because the public humanities seem particularly critical and critically well positioned to respond to the urgencies of the times. The meaning of each of your projects and the rubric building publics, humanities combating isolation that brings us together, is both the same and substantially different today than when we started planning for this end of year series a few months back. For one, the foreclosure of the public sphere in the face of COVID-19 shattered academia, both literally but also conceptually, and brought many to question and reinvent their approaches to teaching and research. As I've said before, I believe that all of you found yourselves somewhat ahead the curve, not only in having already explored a range of media for your projects, but also, and I think more structurally and more importantly, for the creativity and resilience that you knew non-traditional academic work demands. At a more prosaic level, and perhaps more importantly to you all, the COVID-19 crisis cracked open a broom crisis in academia, one particularly acute for graduate students. Tenure-track job offerings have long been in the wane and were announced to totally freeze in March. In this front also, you have already begun to expand your career prospects through public humanities work. Each of your projects stand to show your expertise on teaching students beyond the university or underserved communities, or how to curate digital exhibitions. You already know the amount of work that goes into establishing connections with community partners or activist organizations, and what strategies work best to translate humanistic thinking to address their audiences and their issues. But the most critical intervention of your work, as I see it at least, in fact pertains to the traditions within the humanities and the boundaries that define it. As we've said before, the isolation we claim to combat in the title here refers above all to academic silos, academic fields bound within themselves, their known methods, and their screened audiences, and in accordance to class and racial protocols defined by and for purposes of exclusivity. These protocols structure most of our classrooms, our syllabus, footnotes, and even the questions we ask, or some of us ask, in the name of diversity and inclusion. In the past couple of weeks, we have all read, and I have offered, multiple pledges to do more and do better by the social injustices by which we live, particularly in our context, the systemic racism that's structural to academia. From now on, there are no more excuses for each of us to do the work, and reading lists, lectures, and syllabus will proliferate to help us along the way. But of course, the risk remains for such conversations to stay siloed, disengaged from the reality of the conditions of racial, but also environmental, ableist, or legal inequality that concern larger publics. One way to begin altering our systemic injustices, if such is indeed the aim in higher education, may be to more strongly support the work of those who, like all of you, are working closely with community partners and activists, those who are thinking how to bring knowledge production beyond campus and the canon. Those of you who are not only writing about art, literature, history, and ideas in your dissertations, but are also deploying writing, art, history, and ideas for purposes of community building and at their best to help in processes of emancipation. The goal then is not to help you build careers to flee academia, although you might, but that you fleeing academia, for now at least, will help rebuild the humanities into a more just future. Such is at least the vision of the S.O.F. Heyman Center in the Humanities in its ongoing investment in the public humanities. And I want to use the opportunity to thank all of the staff at the S.O.F. Heyman in putting the series together and through the years, and particularly our director, Eileen Giluli, for being such an avid supporter for such a vision for the humanities, and also Adam Capitano from Humanities New York, with whom we partner in this fellowship. Our fellow today is in fact a fellow both with us and Humanities New York, and I'm going to introduce her now. She'll be able to land in more specific ways all of these ideas that I just launched in there by bringing, and she does this by bringing environmental humanities together with youth pedagogy. Akua Banful is a Ph.D. candidate in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, whose research explores the interaction between imperialism and the representations of tropical nature in anglophone, francophone, and lusophone literatures. Her public humanities project carries on her scholarly expertise to shape an approach to critical pedagogy on climate issues with high school students. I'm super excited to hear more about it. She'll introduce her project, but also some of the guests that are here with us today to talk about it and workshop the project. As a form of a reminder in terms of the format, I'm gonna ask that everybody remain muted, and ideally also with their cameras off while Akua is giving her presentation, but also that please everybody come back to live with your cameras and your microphones for the Q&A following her presentation, and for purposes of the discussion. For these, we offer two options. One is that you raise your hand digitally in the participants toolbox. You can click the raise hand and I will call on you, or that you use the chat box to ask your questions and I'll bring them up during the conversation for Akua. The whole point, as we've said before, is to generate feedback and new ideas together. So we ask that you please do so. I'm sure there's a lot to discuss and new ideas will come out after your presentation. And with that, I'm gonna pass it on to you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Maria, and for the great opening concluding remarks. So before I launch into talking about my project today, I'd like to introduce three guests who have been so gracious as to join us at the Columbia community today. So with us from the Bard High School Early College Manhattan campus are Dean Bill Heinrichs and Professor Ashna Ali. Dean Heinrichs is the Dean of Academic Life at the Bard Manhattan campus and has been my point person in figuring out what shape this project would take, from like transitioning it from a pitch into a course and so on. Dean Heinrichs also visited my classroom during one of our Zoom sessions, so I'm really pleased to have you here. Ashna Ali is an assistant professor of literature also at Bard, and I don't think that teaching this course this semester would have happened without them, for the simple reason that Ashna and I served as graduate representatives on the ACLE board this past year. The special irony in that situation was that Ashna had recently completed their PhD and began their position at Bard, which is how all of this came about. So thank you both for all your help and support, and thank you for being here today. Also with us today is Brooke Stanley, who is a fellow environmental and public humanist. Brooke is an assistant professor of English at the University of Delaware who works on questions of the environmental humanities and postcolonial studies. Brooke has also has a sustained engagement with public humanistic work, and previous projects include a service learning partnership with the New Jersey Organizing Project, while they were a visiting assistant professor at Stockton University. And in this, Brooke collaborated with their students to collect oral histories from residents rebuilding after Superstorm Sandy. So thank you to all three of you for being here today. I'm very, very pleased to have you here. Because I also happen to have the special fortune of speaking in a time of political upheaval and in a movement for racial justice, I figured I would begin by taking the liberty to offer some more general comments about the role of the humanities in our particular moment. At a protest I attended last week, or 2 weeks ago actually, I was struck by the moment where the organizers pointed us all to reading lists, right? That this thinking about a moment where people are out marching in the streets and advocating for change is not divorced from the slow and contemplative work of humanistic inquiry. And I think that that bears out in what we see happening in wider society, where people's impulse is to read, to think, to analyze, to examine. So I think in this moment, we actually really do see the public laying claim to the humanities in a way that, you know, validates our project in this group and also renders our statement a little tautological, because the question I've had in my mind as I've thought about what do the humanities have to offer to our present moment, why are they relevant, what should we be reading and what should we be thinking about, is also, you know, who are the humanities for if not for the public? So those are some general thoughts that have occupied me in the past few weeks. But today I'd like to speak actually about my project, and I'd like to speak about it both conceptually and practically. Let me just make sure I am in slideshow mode. So my project, which I pitched as Climate Arts, Reading, Making, Recycling, is a curriculum model. Thank you to Adam Capitanio for that language. So it's a curriculum model that exposes public high school students and generally students of the high school age to the ways in which the literary and visual arts can participate in the conversation about climate change. In it, I wanted to place special emphasis on recycled materials, in part because when, you know, central to many of our environmental and sustainable sensibilities is the idea of recycling as doing something good, as contributing to the movement. And yes, it's obviously good to recycle. I am not going to go on record as saying that that is not the case. But at the same time, our impetus to recycle sometimes flattens and covers over, you know, the interrogation of consumption that needs to happen. And it also seemed like a profoundly local way to get students involved in thinking about art beyond the stereotypical canvas sculpture and etc. So that was the premise of my project. It was actually spurred by reading Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, where he talks about the seeming absence. This is a book from 2016, where he talks about the seeming absence of representations of climate catastrophe in what he calls serious fiction. And he says, and I quote, "For let us make no mistake, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of the imagination." This is one of the tenets that has stuck with me as I've designed and implemented this project, for the simple reason that, you know, if we are going to advocate for a more sustainable and just future, it does stand to reason that we first have to be able to imagine it, right? And that's like the most succinct articulation I can think of for why literature, why arts are, you know, relevant in the conversation about climate change, which predominantly many of us conceive of it, and I know my students certainly did in the beginning, as a conversation between scientists, the public, and our political apparatus, wherever, in whichever part of the world you might happen to live in. So to think about imagination as perhaps not the thing that's going to fix everything, but a very key step to participating in this conversation was, you know, what I took from Ghosh's call. And his call is to artists and writers and, you know, practicing artists, but I wanted to design an educational experience for young people who happen to be the vanguard of the current climate movement, that, you know, gave them exposure and practice with, you know, exposure and practice with art making, not simply as a mode of expression, but also as a mode of contemplation. That was first and foremost on my agenda. And also gave them experience and practice with participating in the conversation on climate change with their imaginations, to think that this is a relevant tool to bring to the table. So this is the conceptual underpinning of the project I designed. When I first pitched this to the Heyman Center in February of 2019, the structure was quite loose. So initially I had imagined kind of an after-school extracurricular program that would be a hybrid reading group / art making group, you know, so something that was low stakes, something that could meet people where they were. But as I began to identify which institutions I might want to partner with and began to figure out, you know, how to appeal to the demographic I most wanted to interact with, I realized that I needed a bit more structure. And that's because I wanted to work with high schoolers, and high school students are very busy. They have their plates full, they have a lot going on. And if I was hoping to speak to them during the academic year, stood to reason that I was going to have to scale it up. So when Ashna put me in touch with Dean Heinrichs late last year, the proposal I pitched was actually a co-curricular program. And I pitched this as a co-curricular program mostly because I didn't set out to teach a class because I didn't presume that a school would have room for me in their curriculum, would have room to incorporate me in that way. But what I did is that I broke this curriculum model into 3 separate modules. So the first had to do with the reading, right? So that had to do with reading essays, such as excerpts from The Great Derangement and short stories and plays that gave them food for thought with respect to the role of arts and like the imagination and climate change, and then offered them models of the sorts of things they might go on to create themselves. And then in the second module, it was doing much of the same with visual arts, with shining a spotlight on recycled arts. The second model was also planned to revolve around like visits to museums, visits to galleries, taking advantage of all that New York City had to offer, on which more later, because as I'm sure you can all imagine, COVID happened. And then the final module was to give students a structured environment in which to pursue their own projects. So be it something written, be it something visual, they were going to get the support and have like artistic critique sessions. So this is my project as I pitched it to BARD initially. When Dean Heinrichs and I began to work on how we might make this a reality, it turned out that he was happy to like have me on board and accommodate me. And in fact, where BARD had room for me was if I would scale this up into a full course that I would teach over the course of this semester. So I scaled this up further and built a syllabus instead. And we went back and forth over how many credits it would be worth, because obviously there needs to be buy-in on the part of the students, and nothing is a better buy-in than, you know, academic credit. So this is the syllabus I designed, and because, you know, one of the core tenets of building this class or building this experience had to do with approaching art as both a mode of expression and contemplation, and because it was a 1-credit course, the primary assignment that my students had was a weekly journal entry where they would reflect on and respond to the readings or the art pieces in a less formal and in a less high stakes setting. And then once we were in the creative model where they were making their own projects, it became a place for them to reflect on what was inspiring them, what media they were using, what challenges they were confronting. So I tried to build tools to make this a reflective and contemplative and yet expressive exercise into the kinds of assignments I gave my students. So in the middle of teaching this class, actually right at the end of the first module, so yeah, right at the end of the literary arts and like fiction reading module, the pandemic hit. And what that did is we all had to pivot to online education, and it was truly admirable to see the way my colleagues at BARD like adapted in the space of a second. Like there wasn't a lot of consistent information from the state, but people at BARD were ready, and that was really incredible to be a part of. So we pivot to online education with the pitfall that all the museum visits and interactions that were central to the second module of the course I had designed were now moot. But the curse actually ended up being a bit of a blessing, because while there were several exhibits up in the city that dealt with climate change, and actually like an impressive amount of them, I had a bit more curatorial autonomy as a teacher to decide, you know, I wasn't bound by space and I wasn't bound by time. So as oversaturated as the art scene in New York is, there were several things that I could cherry pick and hand to them. We were going to go to Arcadia Earth, which is like an interactive earth-based museum, and we were going to spend some time at the Jack Scheinman Gallery, exploring the works of the Ghanaian Nigerian artist Ellen Atsui, there's a thumbnail of one of his pieces on the syllabus. But it actually ended up being deeply enriching because the students got to, in watching a mix of documentaries and exploring like various online exhibits, like whatever was available pretty much, the students got a lot more context than they might have gotten if we were walking around in the museum and trying to be quiet. So I do think that, it's a bit of a letdown to not be able to do the museum visits and like be very hands-on with the art. But in terms of what my students got out of it, I think that it still worked out fine. And I wouldn't choose online education over, doing this in person, but I do think it gave me more food for thought about how to implement this going forward. And also, like, one of the final disappointments is that the culmination of this course was to be an exhibition where the students would be able to show their work, but obviously that isn't happening physically. But I'm pleased to report that I have been given permission to show you some of their work, which I will do shortly. So that's as much as I can say about implementing the project and how that worked, like practically and conceptually. For the students who ended up pursuing visual arts projects, I also had them write their own exhibit labels. So you'll also have a chance to see some of that shortly. And moving forward, I have continued to think about ways to impart this programming to like similar and different audiences, because although I didn't plan this as a full semester course, I do see the merits of it because I feel that I and my students got a far more sustained engagement with the materials because of it. And so I am currently working, or I will be working with the Climate Museum in ways to like adjust this programming in the space of a day, in the space of a week, to give high school students the kind of impetus to incorporate the visual and the literary arts and their imaginations into what we call their climate plans or their plans and visions for the future. So this iteration, or the pilot iteration of this project, has now been wrapped up. My students actually presented their work yesterday. But moving forward, I will be constructing various different iterations of climate arts and climate programming for young and old alike, or at least that's the aim and the goal. So thank you. I'm going to end by leaving up some of my student works, and I will give you some time to like look at them, and you could ask me any clarifying questions about them since they're sadly not here to speak for themselves today. Okay, so this is the first piece, and I'll leave this up for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll switch on to the final one, and then perhaps we could pivot into a general discussion and I'm very happy to take questions or comments about my project.
It's a beautiful piece, Akua. Are you going to show others, or are you?
Yeah, I was just giving people a chance to like.
Wonderful, wonderful. Great.
Yeah, so this is the second one. Okay. So I guess I'm just gonna leave this up, and then we could pivot into questions and so on. But that's it from me in terms of like didactic presentations for today.
Thank you so much, Akua. That was so rich and so so well laid out, no? As I said before, you know, this tension between the content and the ways that we engage with the publics that we want to engage, and the means and the media by which we do it, no? That's a lot of work that goes into those kinds of adjustments. No, and even the adjustments of your preconceptions as you went into the project of what this might look like, and the need to really go deep into community relationships to develop the project in a way that it's meaningful. And obviously by the result of your students' work, there was quite a lot, no, that you were able to do with them. I have, now I think it is time, and Kay just sent a message that everyone turn back your cameras on.
Do you want me to leave this up, or I could also stop sharing and we could pivot back?
Up to you. I like having the images. That way, perhaps you can go back and forth or leave them down. It doesn't.
Okay, I'll leave it up.
Yeah. But everyone, yes, please turn on your cameras and start asking questions or having comments. I have a lot of questions. One is perhaps you could talk a little bit, because of course, the basis of your methodology here, no, that art and art practices are a means into unleashing imagination, no? It's kind of like the arts tradition, the artist tradition. But of course, what you're saying, and we're all saying, that the humanities is also a means to unleash imagination, that is not just the sort of realm of the artist to which the humanist sort of responds to and constructs meaning. You're sort of complicating that formula much more. And just to bring it down, I'd love to hear you more of precise exercises by which you help your students to work both with images or objects and words at the same time, because there's a tradition in which, you know, art students work with objects very well, and the word might remain a little, you know, to the side or the opposite. But you seem to be getting, you know, by the way even that you lay out these assignments, there's the object and then there's description. We see probably the final product of what were many iteration drafts and exercises in the middle that you work with them in bringing those two together.
I mean, how I chose to approach it in terms of like pairing, you know, like humanistic and artistic practice actually happened in a rather informal way. So in the build up to completing their final projects, especially the artistic modules, what I did was I gave my students the opportunity to like pitch their project and ask them to scaffold like what they wanted to do, why they wanted to do it, and how. And we would have weekly meetings where instead of meeting in class as in like a general classroom format, we would have one-on-one meetings where I would get to push them back and forth. We'd pull in citations, we'd pull in sources, and then think about how that might translate into the project that they were making. Another student actually wrote a piece on waves and water, which is a little harder to display in the sense of like a PowerPoint presentation. But there was a lot of back and forth about, you know, like, what is your intervention? What are you trying to say, like express and think with your audience at the same time? And also, you know, like, let's pull in the sources. Let's make this a slow and contemplative process. So it was a very, I guess, like one of the ways that it's easier to bridge like artistic and humanistic practice is by injecting like human interaction, which sounds very self-evident, but also is incredibly helpful.
What other questions or comments? Yes, Brooke, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Akua, for sharing this fabulous project with us. This sounds like such a wonderful pedagogical tool and wonderful experience. I was curious about kind of the range of practices of gathering materials that your students ended up engaging in. And I was thinking both about your emphasis on recycled materials, and I'm looking at these recycled Trader Joe bags in this image that we're looking at. But then I was also thinking about the context of the pandemic, right? And how the logistics might have been different than they otherwise would be in terms of where students could go and collect materials or feel comfortable doing that. So I'm just kind of curious what conversations you had with them about how to select materials for their projects, whether those were more logistical or more conceptual conversations, and kind of what some of the range of their responses and adaptations were like.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Brooke. That's a great one. I guess predominantly I would ask them, what do you have access to right now? Because especially because we're in a pandemic, if we had done this in a more traditional way, I was also going to like bring in some materials. We were going to play with different things. But now that we're all confined to our homes, I would ask them, what do you want to execute? What is your idea? What do you have at home? Or what could you get without like, you know, running up a bill or like getting stuff off of Amazon? Like, what do you have? What can you achieve? And that's what produced the sustainability costume, for instance, right? Where my student was like, oh, I don't know, but my parents have a lot of Trader Joe's bags hanging around. So maybe I should do something with that. And I'm like, yeah, go on. So she would have made the boxed water, which is her accessory. She would have probably assembled that out of literal boxed water, but improvised that instead. So there was a lot of talk about improvising, you know, making do. And that's also been excellent because that's kind of the premise of recycled art, and that's kind of the premise of like a lot of the work Ella Natsui does, and we spend a lot of time, you know, interacting with his practice as well. So it seems like being improvisational was incredibly helpful and important, and I think that made their projects richer and better too.
Milan, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I was just really blown away by these captions and wondering, like, you know, yeah, did you work with the students on like caption writing as a skill in its own right? Because I feel like, you know, especially like in real museums and galleries, there are so many captions so much worse than this. So like, did you work on that with them explicitly? If so, how did you do that? If not, like, how did they end up so good?
I mean, I think I should first shout out just like the work that is going on at the Bard High School Early College, because, you know, like I didn't have to do, like the students were ready to roll with me from day one. Their teachers do an excellent job with them. But the skills of a university writing instructor are sneakily useful. You know, like the mixed structure of having students write formal drafts and then extracting what is good in it or like what is striking in it and being like, this seems to be where you're going, like, why not do this? Or, you know, having a student tell you, this is my idea. She's like, so sustainability costume was actually a very throwaway statement by my student when she's like, it just feels like people just wear like, you know, people pull around their like metal straws as a costume. Like it's just a front. And I'm like, I think you're onto something. Why don't keep going? So this is where like the training of like a humanistic scholar and teacher is incredibly helpful, because you're able to like listen to what people are saying and parrot it back to them in a way that yields really good things.
Can you talk about a little bit more? I think this conversation is fascinating, sort of in going into how much work it takes, because you're bridging here the sort of traditional studio work in an art school or in an architecture school, where you say it's not the private, you know, everyone is developing their own design, their own project. But of course, what you're doing here is to bring the sort of the larger social issue of climate justice to bear on those sort of individual narratives of design. Mm-hmm. And that's what I find so fascinating. So I would love to hear you talk about, you know, on the one hand, you have the one-to-one individual conversation with each student, but I'm sure that there were some collective issues that emerged that made each student think of their own concerns and, you know, their recycled bags or whatever else at, you know, at the systemic level, at the level of, you know, climate urgencies.
Yeah.
And how you work with them on that, or is that something that happens at the end of the project as everyone comes together? Because it seems to me that that's sort of the critical value among other many values of your project, but the critical value is how do you develop a curriculum model, as you say, that helps bring that tools of critical discussion about climate change, but also public consciousness?
Mm. Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I'd say that that's where the reading in the like subtext of the project is front and center. And it was a very deliberate decision to have the literary and the like essayistic module go first. So we actually did start, you know, like the class, the tenor of the classroom was very interesting in that way, because we started as a very traditional like literary classroom, and then moved more into like an art historical space, and then moved into like more of a studio workshop space. But the decision to like start with like, I mean, obviously I'm also like an English PhD candidate, so the literary like seminar room is in my wheelhouse, and I decided to start with what I knew. But it was also a very deliberate framing device to like put certain questions, issues, and frames of thinking on the table. And this is one of the moments where having to scale this up into a full semester long course was exceedingly helpful, because we had a full like almost 6 weeks of going back and forth about this material, right? So by the time you've moved into the like one-on-one like artistic studio practice space, those ideas are still echoing in your head. I think I'm confessing to playing a game of Inception with my students, but I'm not very ashamed of it.
I think that was a very successful move, and one that sort of brings the whole public humanities or sort of humanities aspect to the center now of the project, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you.
So I see a hand. Amanda, please.
Hi, thanks, Akua. This is a beautiful presentation. I'm really fascinated by the way you encourage students to like apply the theoretical readings to their own work and to their own engagements, or like immediately. I really think that seems very effective to me. And I guess I was wondering if you could take a moment to also reflect on how doing this kind of public humanities project has maybe influenced your thinking or your theorizing about your own academic work going forward. Because I would imagine that on the one hand, we as academics sort of like have our, we were sort of, or especially as PhD candidates, it's like you're reading and you're working on your dissertation, you're sort of doing it sort of in your own little world. And so I'm wondering what, if there's anything productive that you found, or any issues that came up for you that were new when you were sort of working with students in a hands-on capacity like this.
I mean, thanks for that question, Amanda. That's really insightful. The funny thing is that this project is tangentially related to my dissertation work. It's born of it, but also kind of goes in a whole different direction. And some of that is also born of the fact that I've gotten very accustomed to learning to explain what I do to people who aren't scholars. So it's like, if I'm asked, what do you do and why is this relevant and how can you justify your life spent in a silo, which is kind of like when people are feeling unfriendly, that might be the tenor in which they ask the question. And it's incredibly helpful to think of ways to apply or think of like anecdotal ways to like expand that thought. So I'm saying, hey, I'm writing about how ideas of the tropics circulate and calcify and how they continue to circulate and how all of that is embedded with imperialism. But if you don't want to listen to me, here is this clip from Trevor Noah's comedy special where he says the exact same thing. Imagine reading a book about that, right? So I guess like for me personally, it's always been incredibly important to be able to explain what I do to people, because I guess that's very important with being able to explain, like justify my own work and existence to myself, to get deeply existential for no called for reason. So I think there's some of that, and but in terms of thinking about how to apply my dissertation work, like to think about like the impetus to like application and dissemination is something that I have been thinking a lot about, like on the heels of this project, on the heels of this moment. And it's one of those things that I think I will be doing more of, and I have the opportunity to do more of that kind of work over the next few years. So the answer is yes, and also stay tuned. Unclear. Thank you.
Great, thank you, thanks.
We have the other Amanda. I will say, I haven't asked that you introduce yourselves, but both Amanda Lowe, yeah, and Amanda Harding are incoming public humanities fellows for the next year. And Milan, who just asked a question earlier, is one of our outgoing fellows. So Amanda, you've unmuted yourself, yeah, good.
Yes, thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation. And I actually, this past semester, I just TA'd an environmental history class. So I'm really intrigued with the way you thought through your pedagogies of the environment. And being in a history discipline, I'm really, really intrigued with your conversation on imagination, because sometimes by my discipline, I feel a little bit limited to like, okay, we can only really discuss what happened in the past. But something I noticed in my students was oftentimes a lot of despair in terms of thinking through things like the realities of climate change and climate injustice. And while I think that's important for them to sift through, I often thought like, okay, I don't want a pedagogy that just makes them sort of like sit in despair and feel unmotivated to move forward. Does that sort of make, sort of apathetic, I guess, is the way I would sometimes put it. And so I wonder, I'd just love to hear you talk more about the importance of teaching students how to imagine new possibilities as well as confronting realities, if that question makes sense. I hope that's not too abstract.
No. I think it's really spot on, because in our final meeting yesterday, they were all like, yeah, this art stuff is great, but I'm not really sure what the point of my intervention is. And here I am at the end of the semester being like, actually, let me explain to you like what impact your work might have circulating in the wider world. And they're like, oh, okay. I do think that when you begin to talk about like environmental justice, when you begin to invoke the Anthropocene in the classroom setting, you know, it becomes very the sky is falling, doom and gloom, doom and gloom. And I try to counteract that by being very deliberate in the things I chose to teach. Because I think Jennifer Wenzel is here today, and she's also one of my advisors. So we've done a lot of like environmental humanistic work together over the years. And, you know, like being open to like the possibility of hope has been very pivotal. So I didn't just like give them a fact sheet from like keywords from environmental studies on the Anthropocene, or like show them a video which is like everything is ending. I also had them read sections from like The Mushroom at the End of the World, which are like playful and imaginative, but also talking about, yeah, like in a lot of places, the world has already ended and it has gone on. You know, for them to continue to imagine like other places, other realities, other modes of being. So I think that in terms of like pedagogical approach, you kind of have to cherry pick and be very deliberate. And you curate like the trajectory you give them to at least make them a little hopeful that, you know, imagination does have something to say, that like reading and thinking, and to make sure that they don't feel like you're dropping all this information on them and their minds are touching the void. And then it becomes incredibly difficult to connect back to, okay, what am I gonna do about it? Or like, how am I going to respond in my own little corner? So yeah, but it is a real thing.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I will say, one of the things that I find fascinating about your project, sort of bringing both Amanda's question together, and you've said this at the beginning very deliberately, is that you understand imagination not only within the realm of art practices, which is where many, you know, humanists and artists want to draw the line, or it happens, or in the public humanities. I mean, we've all heard these claims, but that it is the humanities work, there's slow work of thinking, of reading, the critical reflection, the historical analysis, that open up forms of imagination while reckoning with conditions within society or within history. Yeah. And that's a very particular, so maybe, I guess that what I'm saying is that we might do well as we move on in our discussions on public humanities on claiming that imagination as part of the humanities, but also qualifying the kind of ideas that are produced. And I say this as someone who's spent many, many years as a designer, as an architect, who's always thinking about the future and imagining future worlds. And, you know, that world also falls into a lot of utopian, idealistic world that doesn't spend the kind of slow thinking, slow reading that you all do in your work. And that's where I think that the structure, I want to emphasize how the structure of your syllabus, where you put the readings and you sort of focus the analysis before you produce the art practices, I find that very unique and very successful. But we have questions from Alexandra, Alex, and then Milan. Do you want to go ahead, Alex, or you want me to read it? Yeah, you go.
Sure. I just was sort of thinking, you know, the pandemic itself seemed to be the impetus for this sustainability costume, and how just the fact that we have all had to rapidly reimagine our world, whether we want to or not, how has that affected this reimagining of the future that you're hoping your students would do, and the actual art that they produced?
I wonder about that. Is my short answer to that, because I think that a lot of that reimagining is still a project that is very much under construction, which is one of the like encouraging and also terrifying things about living in a time like this, right? We've all adapted very quickly to very swift changes in our ways of living and being. And I think very much that I can speak for myself, and I think I can speak for my students, where like we're all still trying to figure out what this means and what, you know, like how do you even like continue to circulate work? Like how do you circulate thought? How, you know, like how do we all do these things? Because it's exceedingly clear that we can continue to do this work, but how do we adapt? How do we adjust? So I think we're all reimagining, and I think that's a productive, if not entirely conclusive, space at the moment.
Yeah, but also in terms of the times, be very cautious about too much urgency in reimagining and reconstructing over structures that might not need reconstruction or reimagination, that we might want to leave behind entirely. So sometimes the urgency to produce might not necessarily be the most critical or necessary approach. So I think that cautionary disposition, I find it very, very provocative. Milan, you had some more?
Sure, if nobody else has questions, I will ask another. Hearing you talk about your students kind of wondering like what the point of the work was, I was just wondering about kind of social media and the possible sort of wider impact that can have. So I guess, you know, one question is just, are any of the students thinking of sharing these images or the writing on social media? Has that been a kind of explicit part of any of their projects? And maybe more broadly, do you see a place for social media within this project of your own?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I will start by confessing that I'm kind of, you know, I'm not the most social media savvy person that exists around.
Yeah, same here.
But my students definitely are, and that is an option. So I think because we've just concluded things, we're still talking about how to continue to circulate this work, or how to continue to circulate their experience, or how to continue to engage with these sorts of questions. And one of my students will actually be joining me to talk to like further high school students who will be like thinking about incorporating the arts into their own program. So there's a certain degree of like, well, you've done the making, let's go back to some of the thinking and the speaking to help other people like keep going on. So currently I'm thinking more in terms of like a replicative model. And I think that, you know, I'm very happy to like have partnerships with people who are more social media savvy than me and understand how to like manipulate that world and incorporate it into like a sphere like this. So TBD, but right now it's kind of about replication and, you know, scaling up and trying to like disseminate this kind of programming to other high school students at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of process that will work towards, you know, this reciprocity, you know, of the humanistic work, the artistic production, and the production of knowledge and new ideas in the back and forth, no? So that the making is not the end point, but just part of the process of construing this collective consciousness, no, on climate issues for the youth. We have a few more minutes. We have our wonderful guests from BARD. So if they do want to comment on Akua wonderful project and the way that it fits, or if that's fit there, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Akua. This is an amazing project. It's so nice to hear about how it sort of unfolded and what conclusions you've drawn, since I was mostly only involved at the very inception. I mean, this is a very basic question, but I have to ask it given my position. How has working with early college students in this age group affected your approach to pedagogy for older students in a more traditional undergraduate setting?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things Dean Heinrich said to me was to like, obviously the BARD students are exceedingly prepared for like the kind of work in the material, which is why I think it worked this well. But he said like, you know, scaffold and, you know, explain to them what you want from them so you can get that kind of like product. And I think that that is a good thing for any teacher to know, to be more deliberate about what they're asking their students to do, and to actually like sit down and think about what is the actual, to use a very corporate term, what is the actual deliverable of this task. Because I think high school students, perhaps a bit more than college students, like want to know what the point of it is.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you also kind of need to be a bit more deliberate and reflective about what you're doing and why, so that you're a lot more ready to like explain, connect the dots, and show them where you're going. That's the case in a college classroom, but I think with early college students, it's even more imperative to be able to explain like what you're doing, why, where is this going?
I had a comment, which is that the students in the class have all spoken to me individually at least once to thank you for putting this class together and say how meaningful it was, that it filled a real need for them educationally. And these are students who had a whole variety of offerings, but this was something they didn't know was possible, and it changed their perception of the humanities. I'm wondering, as you're wrapping up the class, what kind of sense you got from them about next steps, what impact they'd had, or this has had on them, and they're thinking about their continuing studies.
Yeah, thank you for that. And also thank you for those general remarks. In terms of their continuing studies, I think that it's a sense of how the humanities can actually be like a hybrid space, as opposed to like a more straitjacket, like you read, you think, you analyze. You can also like, there's room for creative manipulation. I think that's happening. I think we're also still like all remaining in contact, and I'm trying to like loop them into further opportunities where they can continue to engage with these kinds of issues or these kinds of questions. But I sincerely hope that the drive to, you know, like think expressively and like reflectively about material they encounter will like provide an added degree of depth to like the analysis they go on to do. Yeah, they were an actual dream class to have this term. I couldn't have asked for better students.
Wow, that was it was wonderful, now to see this project that you had the chance to, you know, conceive it, rethink it, and implement it to the end. This is really wonderful that you were able to find all of this network, and I'm sure we're only seeing here 3 of what has been a much larger group of people that you've collaborated with, and that we've been able to hear from your BARD colleagues from their perspective. So thank you, all of you, for being here, from of course supporting this kind of work. We need more of that. It was great to hear all of you talk about, you know, the reciprocal value that exists in this kind of work. And we hope that a lot more of it happens in the near future. So thank you so much, Akua, for your work, and congratulations for the project. Really very well done from beginning to end. Of course, the work of your students could belong to an exhibition, an online exhibition of the kind that Alex of Erin is designing, or it could belong to a podcast of the kind that Milan and Olivia are doing. And I'm just sort of making this comment of sort of to think of the landscape, no, of projects and ideas that cross-reference one another. So thank you, Akua, for your presentation today, everyone, for being here, but also thank you, Alex, Milan, Olivia, Erin, Maeve, and who am I missing? Scott, for all of your work through the years. I already gave my spiel at the beginning. So now I'm just gonna wish everyone an intense but safe summer, as we hope the coming months will be for everybody, and that we keep the conversation going, perhaps through the summer, but certainly in the spring, with new projects, with iterations of old ones. And as we've been saying throughout, the hope here is to really build a critical mass and a community of public humanities work around the SOF Heyman. And these series have been amazing in doing that, but we want everyone to keep coming and making connections, and people saying, oh, I want somebody to do this kind of course. We're here for that, and to keep thinking differently and thinking new and critically about how the humanities can and must work in the world. And with that, I think we should adjourn. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you.